Kiara koto katoa. This particular conversation is addressed to migrants. As we have seen over the last year, but actually really over the last 5 years, there have been increasing attacks on migrants across the globe. These attacks have often taken the form of subtle forms of racism, but in some other instances, we have seen the attacks be much more explicit, be much more violent, where migrants have been targeted. In developing anti-racist strategies addressing the racism that is experienced by migrants, solidarity is a key concept. And in this particular talk, I want to speak directly to migrants on the concept of solidarity. Solidarity means connecting to the struggles and experiences of others. So for migrants, when you consider the question of solidarity within the context of anti-racism, it is important to think about the ways in which you can connect with others in addressing racist structures. Often with migrant communities, with an emphasis on addressing the racism faced by the particular community, we tend to turn inward. So, say for instance, as an Indian origin migrant, I am more sensitized to, I am more exposed to stories of racism experienced by Indians, for instance. But this kind of echo chamber within which migrants often exist is a problem when we think about addressing the broader question of racism and actually leaves the racist structure intact. It does so by not really addressing the overarching and broader contexts within which racism operates. So as migrants, to the extent to which we are concerned about, we are focused on the racist experiences of our own communities, it limits us from connecting with other communities, from looking at the experiences of other communities, from working together with other communities, and most importantly, from actually developing a justice-based framework that says that racism anywhere in any form will not be tolerated. So to be able to see connections and to be able to see connections across ethnic communities, to be able to see connections across migrant communities is vital. And the work of developing culture-centered anti-racist interventions in this sense is really to connect across spaces. This then brings me to my second point, which actually is a difficult conversation to have, which is as migrants, when we are looking at the experiences of racism within our own communities, we also have to examine the ways in which our communities are racist, or the ways in which racist attitudes, beliefs, behaviors perpetuate within our own communities. I will give you a couple of examples to elucidate this. So say, for instance, when CARE has done its work in the United States within the context of African American health and Black experiences of racism, one of the things I've often heard from Indian migrants is the stereotypical construction of the African American community. In fact, the Indian migrant community often holds deeply racist attitudes and beliefs about African Americans. The community perpetuates stereotypes about African Americans, all the way from African Americans being lazy, sucking on welfare, to being dangerous and being criminals. As a result of that, often you will find that large cross sections of Indian communities actually respond in support of police violence or uh, racist police practices targeting African Americans. So we have to closely look at these forms of racism that exist within our own communities. Another example I wanted to point out is within the context of COVID, the anti China and the racism directed at Chinese communities on WhatsApp, on digital platforms. I have seen multiple instances within the Indian diaspora as well as within the Indian community in India, memes, visual constructions that are fundamentally racist and directed at Chinese. So that's another instance where, if you look closely at the practices and beliefs within the community, you see the overarching structures of racism. So this practice of looking inward is vital to actually examining the constructions of power, the flows of power, and where a particular migrant community sits in relationship to the power. So, for certain cross sections of migrant communities being model minorities, assimilating into the broader culture is about accepting and perpetuating the racist ideologies of the overarching structure. So, in fact, often in multiple instances, one becomes a model minority by mirroring some of the racist ideologies of the overarching structure. So, as migrants, it's really vital to look at these forms of racism within our communities, to examine closely our practices, to look at how these play out with power configurations within our communities, and how then that perpetuates an overarching racist structure, keeping it intact. My third point relates to the ways in which migrant communities relate to indigenous peoples and indigenous communities. Here in Aotearoa, for instance, being a migrant, when you express experiences of racism, it is important to remember and consider that the colonial architecture of the country has perpetuated this racism historically toward Maori. And this racism has had significant consequences for Maori, all the way from displacement from land to ongoing colonial structures that continue to perpetuate the marginalization of Maori. Now, if we have an honest conversation, often within our migrant communities, we hold attitudes, beliefs, behaviors that are racist toward Maori and that really reflect and mirror the racist attitudes of the colonial structure. Now, I have seen this, for instance, within the Indian community, where the colonial stereotypes of the lazy Maori or of the alcohol consuming Maori or of the Maori on welfare are perpetuated by the Indian community. And it actually works in terms of perpetuating this stereotype. It actually works to keep the colonial structure intact. So, recognizing this and placing oneself in solidarity with the struggles of Tangata Whenua is vital to developing anti-racist interventions. If you consider the experiences of your own family, of your child that is experiencing racism and you want to address that, you cannot do that in a silo. You cannot do that in disjuncture with or separated from the experiences of Maori in Aotearoa. And anchoring anti-racist struggles of migrants in conversation with and in solidarity with the struggles of Maori in Aotearoa is vital to challenging a colonial structure and the racism that is configured into that structure. The fourth point I want to make is with the concept of solidarity is in relationship to the neoliberal project. Understanding racism in relationship to the neoliberal project. Neoliberalism being a form of economic consolidation of power as well as consolidation of political power in the hands of elites carried out in the name of the free market that has simultaneously perpetuated massive inequalities across the globe. So when we look at the neoliberal project in that sense, certain categories of migrants, for instance, again, I think about Indian and Chinese migrants with access to educational infrastructures, with access to specific forms of mobility, have actually been able to place themselves in positions of power in relationship to the neoliberal project. In fact, for instance, if you look at the US today, and if you look at the Indian diaspora in the US, large cross sections of Indians have done fairly well. Of course, when I say this, I recognize that there are also large cross sections of working class, precarious class Indians that are the targets of the neoliberal interventions. But I'm talking about the cross section of Indians that have actually done well with the neoliberal project. And a fundamental ideology that is propelled and perpetuated within that class is one of self-help, self-reliance, and market-based interventionism. And therefore, within that context, when we think about racism, we talk about racism in organizational structures, we talk about prejudice and biases, but we fail to look at the overarching inequalities within which we inhabit. As a result of that, we actually fail to build solidarity with the working classes, the precarious classes. Often you find that upwardly mobile and upper class migrants live in gated communities, live in their own cocoons, disconnected from the struggles of the working classes, who have had to face the dramatic impact of neoliberal policies, all the way from lacking access to decent income, to lacking access to basic food, to lacking access to healthcare. We are seeing this in the US now. So there is massive disenfranchisement of a large cross section of the population. And we have to situate the conversation on racism as migrants in relationship with, within the broader context of this larger inequality. So in that sense, what I'm asking for us to do is to look at various forms of inequality, be it class-based inequality, be it race-based inequality, be it gender-based inequality, and building solidarity platforms that speak across and that dialogue across these challenges. And that means that as migrants to a country, as migrants to a community, we have fundamental responsibilities in addressing issues such as poverty, in addressing issues such as childhood poverty and opportunities for children in poverty, issues such as access to healthcare, and issues such as housing and homelessness, and how we connect our anti-racist struggles to these fundamental struggles for life and livelihood among the precarious classes is a powerful and important question for anti-racist interventions, particularly within the migrant context. It also offers an antidote to the various xenophobic political parties that leverage these inequalities in order to further perpetuate, on one hand, neoliberal policies, and on the other hand, target migrants. So you're addressing that head on by actually building connections with the working classes. My final point that I will come back to is the importance of seeing through these processes connections CARE has housed a number of activists and residents that have talked about the vitality of connections in anti-racist struggles. Our activist and residents and the Green MP, Teano Tuino, talked about during his residency the importance of solidarity, particularly solidarity between the working classes and migrants and Maori struggles, for instance. Similarly, Maurice Lant, another of our activists and residents, talked about solidarity between Tangata Whenua and migrant ethnic communities. Now, the colonial structure and the colonial architecture works classically through practices of divide and rule, so that we are actually organized by the structure in ways where we are prevented from seeing these connections. It is therefore incumbent upon us to look beyond these limitations that are imposed by structures, to dialogue, to understand, to empathize with the struggles of others who have to bear the burdens of these deep inequalities that have been produced over the last 3 decades by relentless neoliberal reforms, and actually then from that work build creative strategies for change that is committed to addressing racism, and change that is committed to addressing the politics of extraction, which produces precarity. So throughout the year, we will talk about different ways of looking at this question of solidarity. We will bring activists into this conversation to actually think about and brainstorm on strategies and tactics for building this kind of solidarity. And I look forward to having you with us on this journey. Thank you.